And it's my pleasure now to introduce Luis Cabrera, who is Professor of Political Science at Griffith University in Brisbane, Australia. His research is focused on theories and practices of democracy, human rights, and regional and global citizenship. He has authored 3 books and edited or co-edited 3 others, besides publishing more than 40 journal articles and book chapters. The book that he's shared with the book club in the last couple of months is his latest one, The Humble Cosmopolitan: Rights, Diversity, and Trans-State Democracy. And today we've asked Professor Cabrera to discuss with us chapters 7 through 10. So, Professor, if you'd please give us an overview of those chapters, and then those on the call afterward might be able to ask some questions or offer some comments. Okay?
Okay, so here's the book cover again
It's just
with Ambedkar.
About the
I had a question there. I couldn't quite hear it.
Yeah. Okay, I think that might have been something with the audio. So if you'd begin again then.
Okay, so thank you very much. I will speak very quickly to chapters 7, 8, and 9, which is where I begin to apply much of it. So in chapter, it's again a book written with the method of grounded normative theory, where I go out and talk to people who are involved in struggles in which I'm interested. And this struggle was mostly in India, but also in the UK. I am looking at arrogance and neo-imperialism objections against cosmopolitanism and ultimately against world government. Because I'm an institutional cosmopolitan, I see integration at the regional and global level as a possible means of advancing rights protections and enabling people to play a significant role in identifying and advancing their own rights protections, thus the democracy in the title. So chapter 7 lays out the full theory of democracy, if you will, of institutional cosmopolitanism and trans-state democracy. The idea is to promote political humility, which is a recognition of the standing of the other and a genuine openness to hearing what they have to say, and looking how we can promote that institutionally. And I look at some other theories of democracy, some of which say democracy stops at the national boundary for various reasons, others which would extend it to the entire world, but in ways that I think ultimately run into some trouble. So what I would like to see, or what I advocate in the book, is a system of regional and ultimately global democracy that is grounded in constitutionalized rights and that tilts egalitarian. So what we don't want is to end up with a plain majoritarian global democracy where the global majority can just subject the minority to whatever its will may be. We want constitutionalized rights before we ever get to that point. And we want people to be able to contribute to those rights protections in various ways, including by challenging them. Challenging rights violations. Thus, I was looking at the National Campaign on Dalit Human Rights in India as a possible model because these were national and local activists, formerly called untouchables, who were pushing back against continuing discrimination. And one of the things they were doing was reaching out to the United Nations human rights regime to try to get recognition for caste discrimination in the major anti-discrimination treaty globally. And they had some successes. Ultimately, the successive Indian governments pushed back pretty hard. Chapter 7 talks about the insights we can take from their struggle for a full model of global democracy. Chapter 8 talks about their major critics in the Bharatiya Janata Party. And this is a party that's explicitly Hindu nationalist in its principles. So it's got a vision for India that goes back more than 100 years of India as a Hindu nation. Others, according to one of the principal gurus of the early formation, one of the leaders of one of the major Hindu national groups called Gavakar, should India is a Hindu nation, which means that its public institutions should reflect Hindu values. And for Gavakar, others should assimilate, Muslims, Christians, etc., should assimilate to those Hindu values publicly. They can, to an extent, they can do what they like privately in their homes, but publicly they should follow Hindu mores. And that can mean everything from not eating beef, which is not part of, it's certainly a Hindu more to not eat beef, but some other cultures in India do not observe that. But if you follow this line of thinking, then you would say that the beef ban should apply to everyone because India is a Hindu nation and it would offend the sensibilities of majority Hindus. So, et cetera, et cetera. And I look at some of their criticisms, primarily revolving around the idea that to criticize India on the world stage in the way that the Dalit activists were doing, some of them were doing, is to be anti-national, to try to bring shame upon India, to try to make India look bad, and they should be patriotic and build it up. So the Dalit activists had to say, or were saying in response, that the patriotic thing is to help India develop in all the ways that it needs to, including by calling it out globally when it needs to be called out. So I looked at that and offered some responses to the idea that it was arrogant of the Hindu activists, or excuse me, the Dalit activists, to go to global allies, global institutions, and try to press their case. And what I argued was that no, actually, that's political humility. They're saying we are not being treated as political equals at home or as social equals, and we need to do what we can to make that happen. So, Chapter 8 presents the findings from my interviews with Bharatiya Janata Party officials and spokespeople. And then Chapter 9 shifts gears over to Europe, to UKIP, to look at some other claims about democracy and the need for it to be national democracy. And these are cultural claims akin to some of the ones the Bharatiya Janata Party will offer, but a little different. So these are claims that offered by the UK Independence Party, and I was interviewing them in 2015 before the Brexit referendum. And when I was interviewing them 7 months ahead of the referendum, not a single person I spoke to in UKIP thought that they were going to be successful. They all said, we know we're not going to win this referendum. We're not going to get Brexit, but we think it's really important to bring these issues to the fore. And they were saying that for democracy to work, you need a common culture, shared history, shared values. And they said that mass immigration of the kind that you see when you're part of something like the European Union, which Britain was at that time, will destroy that. And they would hold up the Turks as the real specter. So Nigel Farage, the sort of lead figure in UKIP and also in Brexit, would talk about the Turks, talk about the specter, he would call it, of Turkish accession. And at that time, before it had fallen way far away from democracy, Turkey was still being considered a candidate for European accession, not as much as it had been earlier in the 2000s, but there was still this idea that Turkey could become a member of the European Union. And what Nigel Farage and other UKIP people would say was that's going to open the floodgates and Britain will be overwhelmed and we won't have a culture anymore. We won't have a democracy anymore. We won't have a country. So it would sound familiar to people in the United States these days. I think this some version of replacement theory. So I looked at I spoke to as many of them as I could over a month, and I, analyzed the findings and identified the kinds of arguments they were making and connected some of those to arguments in the political theory literature and said, these are some of the responses that could be made that in fact, there's little evidence these days that national cultures, are as cohesive or homogenous as this approach would try to say. And even if you're looking at the mingling of the national population of Scotland, so many people are not Scottish by birth, not they're different. And we think of Scotland as maybe one of the most cohesive places there is, even though it's within the United Kingdom. And you begin to look at that kind of evidence, you say, well, actually, the world is a diverse place, and it has been. And where democracy has worked, it's worked primarily under conditions of diversity. And then you look at these arguments for national, and they all tend to fall apart. And that's what I highlighted in chapter 9. The conclusion being that the arrogance and neo-imperialism objections against regional and global democracy don't stand up so well as they've been presented. And so that's where I ended with the book, and saying that the next book must be about how we actually think about getting to more robust regional democracy and then some form of global democracy as we go. And for me, that's going to be, as I've said before here, that's going to be a very long-term project.
So is chapter 9 the final chapter?
Yes, chapter 10 just sort of summarizes the argument and talks about future directions.
All right. So there's just a few of us on the call now, but maybe you have comments or questions. So Joseph, let's start with you. Any reactions to what Luis just said?
Yes, please. Louis, I'd like to ask you one or two questions about your terminology, just questions of fact. I'd like to be able to understand you. This is a complex and difficult book, actually. I found it hard to read. Chapter 9 is easy to read because it's about the UKIP, which we tend to treat as very reactionary, and yet they had clear objections, and you articulate them and you make it clear to us what the Nigel Forge group objected to. One statement was that 80 years ago, the British fought a war to prevent the Germans from governing them, and here they are now trying to embrace the Germans in the European Union. But I'd like to ask one or two questions, starting with the objective. On pages 40 and 79, you define what I think is your conception of Ambedkar's objective, what he wanted to do. Take, for instance, it's on page 40, Ambedkar aimed at social endosmosis. And I confess I had no idea what this meant. I know a little Greek, but this is way out. You also complement this with the Hindu ideal of Maitreya or Maitreyi. On page 79, you also mention this again. So sometimes you use this expression endosmosis / Maitreya as the standard of thinking. Is that correct?
Of Ambedkar's thinking. So Maitreya would be a Buddhist. For him, it was the core Buddhist principle. He's just I would say Ambedkar can be read fruitfully as someone who was a liberal egalitarian and found in many other places, liberal egalitarian principles and wanted to highlight those. So he saw equality in an ancient Hindu doctrine. He wrote about that. He latched onto this idea of endosmosis, and as I tried to say in the book, he was writing at a time when Dalits were not allowed to eat at the same table as other people, as caste Hindus, when they were certainly not allowed to intermarry with them. And so endosmosis, so as I say on page 40, it's Dewey's term, and he's just talking about the movement, the free movement of fluid through a membrane in a cell. And Ambedkar was taken by that term and adopted it and adapted it, extended it. And for him, it became free movement among social groups in society. And then he married that to ideals of equality. And he was talking about human rights as early as 1919. So for him, it always came back to finding ways to promote equality for Dalits. So he wrote about doctrines of equality that were very different from the caste distinctions in Hinduism. So Advaita was this doctrine, and he found it in the Vedas, the ancient texts, and talked about that a little bit. But mostly he looked at various religions. He looked at Christianity. He looked at Islam. He settled on Buddhism as the religion that would embrace the kind of equality that he sought and that would be a vehicle for promoting it. And he actually devised his own conception of Buddhism, Navayana Buddhism, just new Buddhism, and came up with 22 precepts that became sort of a mantra that he had his followers say after him when they converted to Navayana Buddhism. So this group of 300,000 people followed him into Buddhism one day during a ceremony. So I would say for Ambedkar, it all comes back to that kind of equality, and it's a very familiar kind of individual rights equality. And there's a reason he had individual rights enshrined into the Constitution, and then alongside duties. So is that a satisfying answer?
Well, you remarked that he picked up endosmosis from John Dewey in the United States, often regarded as a progressive philosopher. Did Dewey use that expression?
Just a couple
Endosmosis?
of times in one book. So Dewey used it in one of his best-known books, and Ambedkar sort of seized on that and took it and extended it and made it one of his core principles early on. And then
Well,
later on, it evolved into the emphasis on Buddhism.
to take Maitreya as another example, how could the Buddhist conception possibly be used in the Indian context to uphold the idea of human equality? Wouldn't he need a Hindu ideal?
He identified a Hindu ideal, but he decided that for his followers, Buddhism was going to be the more encompassing approach. I think by the end of it, he despaired of persuading caste Hindus that that they should. So Gandhi, let me put it this way: Gandhi's approach was to persuade caste Hindus that they should not discriminate against Dalits, and so Gandhi wanted to keep it all within Hinduism. He said until very late in his life, Gandhi maintained that caste distinctions were okay as long as you didn't treat people as inferiors. So you might be a Brahmin and a teacher or a scholar, and you might encounter someone who's a manual scavenger who removes human waste with hand tools, and you would have a different job category than that person from birth, but you would not treat that person as an inferior. You would treat that person as a child of God. And Ambedkar criticized this. He said, that can't be equality when we're still bound to these dirty, difficult, dangerous jobs. So he looked outside of Buddhism, or excuse me, outside of Hinduism, to try to find something for Dalits. And a lot of Dalits turned to Christianity, but Ambedkar wanted them to turn to Buddhism and his certain version of Buddhism. So he was speaking to Dalits at that time and leading them, and he was pressing back against caste Hindus. And he was ultimately successful because he was such a highly regarded legal mind that Nehru was pressed to appoint him as chair of the Constitutional Drafting Committee. And so he was able to have a lot of influence on what was in the final constitution, including a charter of fundamental rights that was very much in line with what he wanted.
Well, let me, David, if I can ask another question, please.
Sure. I just wanted to respond that we should remember that the Buddha was a Hindu, that
true.
he tried to reform Hinduism and in doing so rejected the notion of caste. Okay. Joseph, your second question?
Yes. Well, Louis, I have to speak frankly. This is a very sophisticated book. I once mentioned, I think it belongs in the field of moral and political philosophy. But let me tell you that in reading this book, I was constantly trying to think of the analogy of Martin Luther King with B.R. Ambedkar. You almost, I think once in the whole book, you even mention him. But you know, for a Western reader, what's in their mind is the example of Martin Luther King, who in his own way struggled for equality. And this you seem to pass over. You want to be fair to the thinking of Ambedkar, who indeed broke with Hinduism, and his problem was much more gross than Martin Luther King's. Ambedkar felt that he had to struggle against the Hindu tradition of color, what they call color. I think originally it was color when the oh shoot, I'm losing my mind.
So karma, perhaps?
When the people of southern Russia came down into India.
Aryans?
The what?
Aryans?
The what?
Aryans.
The Aryans. Yes, a good word to remember. The Aryans came down and they found a dark-skinned people along the Indus River, really, and they compelled them to serve them as workers, and this became the lowest caste. And today you find them way down in the southern part of India. But I wonder if you know what was the ideal of Martin Luther King. You know what he said? What do you think he was searching?
I've written 3 books. I've got a series here that I've got some very specific aims that I'm trying to see. I can see you're frustrated, and I know for historians, writing clearly and accessibly and telling the story is very, very important. And I tried to do that, but I am a moral theorist, and I'm writing to moral theorists. So what I'm trying to do is establish the absolute best case I can for some very difficult arguments against cosmopolitanism, against regional governance, against global government. And so I've been doing this for a while. My very first book, which was my thesis, opens with Dr. Martin Luther King, opens with the Riverside speech, and talks about how toward the end of his life he became a conscious cosmopolitan. So I see absolutely where you're coming from. The point of that book was to tell moral cosmopolitans that they should be institutional cosmopolitans. So speaking to those moral philosophers who said that we need to expand our sentiments to the whole world, but not our institutions. And my point there was saying, no, we also need to expand our institutions. We need to be talking about world government, about global democracy. And certainly I drew on Dr. King there. And I recently found out from my colleague Matthias Koenig-Archibugi's book that Dr. King actually in a speech in 1964 advocated world government. And I'm not sure if that was Harris Wofford's influence, but he explicitly advocated world government in a speech. I had never known that before. I had never seen that. I had seen him talk about the need to move away from national consciousness. So I do hear what you're saying. I appreciate what you're saying. The point in this book was to talk to people in Africa, to talk to people in India, to talk to people in those countries that were trying to keep out Africans and Indians and people from the Middle East, and say that cosmopolitanism, world government, is not just some Western extension of Christianity. It is not in the way that human rights doctrine is sometimes meant to be. It is something that can be and has been embraced by people struggling for equality in many different country contexts. So if I had just gone with Dr. King in this book, it would have been dismissed as simply another Western imperialism treatise. Saying, look at it, we've got our ideas, we've got the right ideas. We should just impose these ideas on you guys. And it was really important for me to say, no, actually, these are homegrown struggles, and they're still homegrown struggles, and we can learn from the struggles over there. So I absolutely take your point about Dr. King. I think he's brilliant. I think he's one of the most inspiring figures the species has ever produced.
Well, if you will let me, I'll fill in the blanks myself.
Certainly.
Louis, maybe this book is quite properly addressed to an Asian audience, and you don't want to bring in Martin Luther King, but and maybe I should go back to the first book to find out how you started. But I was puzzled in my mind for the equivalent of endosis matriae in an American context, and this would be King's goal. And you know what his word was for it?
Sorry?
It was freedom. It was freedom. Thank God Almighty, we're free at last. Thinking about this, I have to say that it seems to me that King did not go too much farther than the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence of the United States. He knew that this country was founded with respect to the equality of human beings, and he constantly referred to this as the professed ideals of the United States. He did not have to justify the freedom for the Black people in the United States by analysis of the Bible, which I think he would find hard to do. But he was constantly referring to the declared ideals of the United States, and he found that Black people, the inferiors in this society, were mistreated because they were not elevated to the level of the ideals of that were well established. So King had a much harder problem than Ambedkar. A much easier problem than Ambedkar. He could not go too much farther than the ideals of the Declaration of Independence and the laws of the United States, whereas Ambedkar was absolutely alone. He found himself virtually outside the reigning racial paradigm in India. He found himself treated as an inferior within the system of Varna or color or caste in India. And what you do is very cleverly draw this out it's a little hard to follow from a Western, starting with Western principles, but it is powerful if you're patient. I must tell you that I found the conclusions in the last chapter 10 very helpful because you get lost. I found chapter 6 just about impossible to read. But by the time of 10, there's a nice summation. And let me just quote a sentence or two from in the conclusion. You write on page 169, throughout this book, I have worked to show how Ambedkar's broader political thought and the actions and views of those inspired by him can inform the development of more comprehensive, more cosmopolitan, supra-state democratic institutions oriented to political humility. Now, I find that a very helpful summation. It brings in humility, as we've gone over it before. Humility, as Ambedkar used it, and as you enlighten us about it, is much more than just deference to authority. That's not what it's all about. It's about what I called confidence in the right, or self-righteousness, and that rightness is in the West is rooted in the Bible, and in his case, it was this kind of composition of endosis and maitreya, derived from several religious traditions in India. So that's all I wanted you to hear how a reader followed this book. I love the part about the English party, that the UKIP, that provoked Brexit, and I'm constantly concerned about the failure of the European Union, and I write for Lucio Levi's book journal, always with the hope that I could add a little dollop to that struggle for unity in Europe, because it's a model for unity in the world. That's all.
Okay. Well, thank you for your close attention to the book. I'm sorry it was a bit of a struggle at times. I am a political theorist. I'm writing to political theorists in this case, not writing for a mass audience, though I was hoping that some of the descriptions in there, the narrative bits, would make it more palatable for students. But perhaps I have to think about that in the next book. One thing I would say, just coming back to Dr. King, in the book, I do spend a bit of time talking about Du Bois, and because he made the outreach to the UN. So in fact, it was Ambedkar took his cues from Du Bois in terms of reaching out to the UN. And he had written that letter to Du Bois, and I think it was 1946, saying, I'm very impressed by what you're doing here, your appeal to the world, that Du Bois and many other people in the NAACP had put together. And some of the activities Paul Robeson was doing in reaching out to global audiences. And so Ambedkar was in some ways inspired by Du Bois, and he put together his own appeal to the world, based on exhaustive evidence of caste discrimination that he was going to send up to the new United Nations, in the same way that Du Bois had. But then he was tapped to be the constitutional chair, and decided to devote his energies to that, and seeing if he could address caste discrimination in India better that way without going to the UN. So he set it aside, and unfortunately, that report that he put together has been lost to history. So I don't know exactly what it said, but he spoke about it. He spoke about doing it.
I
And
have a suggestion of maybe one of the places that King might have latched on to the idea of world federation or world government. King's dissertation was on Henry Nelson Wyman, the same topic that my dissertation was on. And Wyman was a world federalist. So maybe reading Wyman's book, Man's Ultimate Commitment, which mentions the need for a world government, was one of the places that Martin Luther King got that idea. King's dissertation I read in our while writing my dissertation on Wyman, but King was simply in his dissertation contrasting the idea of God in Paul Tillich and Henry Nelson Wyman, and disagreed with both of them. Where in my dissertation, I tried to explain Wyman's ideas of creative interchange and applied that to world federation and world peace. So you might want to just check out the idea of Martin Luther King's dissertation.
Sure, sure.
We haven't, let's hear if anything that Evan or Lynn might have to say in reaction to what Professor Cabrera or Professor Brada have been saying so far. Evan, you just unmuted yourself. We don't see your picture, but do you have any questions or comments?
Well, I'm curious about the degree to which the Declaration of Human Rights is taken up by contemporary Indian thinkers. Is this at all relevant to them?
It would be. So Paul Devakar, who was in charge of the UN outreach for the National Campaign on Dalit Human Rights, their focus was the Treaty on Discrimination, the Anti-Discrimination Treaty that India and more than 100 and I think 140, 150 other countries had signed. And it doesn't explicitly mention caste discrimination. It mentions discrimination by descent. And where they saw the most leverage, where they were focusing their energies, was trying to show that dissent should be interpreted to include caste discrimination. And they were successful in getting that interpretation ultimately from the salient UN body. But India would not accept that interpretation, and India would not accept that it should take direction about doing more against caste discrimination. So in the Universal Periodic Review, which is part of the treaties, the human rights treaties that were inspired by the Universal Declaration, that gives another place for the Indian activists, or it did. They've moved to other things now after 20 years of trying that route, of enlisting global allies in other states who would bring those criticisms in the Universal Periodic Review process. And India was told several times that it needed to do more against caste discrimination. And India would say, we're doing this and that, we're doing these other things. It would not bind itself to that. So it was certainly part of the background dialogue, and they were using the binding human rights instruments to try to get better action from the Indian government.
Evan, any further question or comment? Okay. Lynn, I see you unmuted yourself. We don't see your picture, but do you have a question or
I'm
comment?
surprised that the Dalits were viewed that way by Gandhi. It doesn't make sense. I mean, what does make sense is that everyone should have equal rights, but what doesn't make sense is that by their occupation they were discriminated against, and it seems counterintuitive. And I guess that kind of way of thinking leads to what we have going on now with a starvation campaign against a whole caste of people, the Gazans and the West Bank for that matter too. So what seems to work for human thinking seems to apply itself later when issues come up. And it's a pretty sorry state of affairs that, I personally feel a great deal of guilt not being in Gaza myself and experiencing what they're having to experience. And if you think in terms of reincarnation, for example, it makes me feel horrible that I could be reincarnated, into that kind of a life. And that, we shouldn't have that in any kind of existence, no matter what time frame that is.
Thank you. Yeah, human rights are always tenuous, and we're reminded of that pretty acutely with current events. What's happening in many places around the world. And you mentioned reincarnation. Ambedkar noted that he had to, as Professor Barada was indicating, Ambedkar also had to fight against the doctrine of karma, and he would talk about that, because karma is the idea that you deserve to be in the station into which you were born. On Gandhi's approach, one of the interesting things I found, one of the people I interviewed said, if Gandhi really believed that, then he would have been a shopkeeper, because he was born a Banya man. He was born into the Banya grouping, and they were shopkeepers traditionally. So Gandhi shouldn't have been a leader of the resistance. He should have gone and been a shopkeeper. But so he was indicating that it was a little hypocritical for Gandhi to hold that position, and Gandhi dropped that position later in his life. Toward the end of his life, he was no longer arguing that that caste distinction should be upheld in that way. Gandhi was always an advocate of treating everyone equally. Everyone is equally worthy, and that was a very radical position for his time, and it generated some resentment against him, among other things. Not only were Dalits to be treated equally and embraced, but Muslims and other people who were on the outs with many Hindu leaders were to be treated equally, etc. So, and then yeah, I think no, good thoughts. Good thoughts.
Joseph, did you have any other comments or questions?
Oh, yes. I must admit that I have many quotations about world government from Gandhi, and I'd be delighted to send them if you're really curious. These are all dated from that period before his death in 1948. I am not aware that Martin Luther King was any explicit exponent of world government in the 50s. I could look at a good place to look is in the quotations that are emblazoned on the walls of his memorial in Washington, D.C. But really, King is remembered for his criticism of the Vietnam War, which he made as late as 1967 in Rockefeller at the church in Rockefeller Plaza, and it was quite enough for King to criticize the United States for its policy in Vietnam as late as 1967, without asking him to endorse world government. Frankly, I cannot think, and I'm kind of attuned to this, but I cannot think of any statement by Martin Luther King about world government
It
before
surprised me too.
1967.
Yeah, if you like, I can take a picture of it's in this book here, it's called The Universal Republic, a Realistic Utopia ? So Matthias teaches at the London School of Economics. He's a professor there of political science, very, very serious sort of quantitative scholar. And what this does, it was just published last year, is go through and run the numbers on feasibility of global democracy based on what we know about national democracy and the characteristics of the global system. So it's really interesting. I can't claim that I can follow all the numbers and all the formulas, but it's really interesting. And then it was the first I had ever seen Martin Luther King quoted as saying he supported a world government. And I'm looking on my scribbles here to see if I can find which page it's on, but I will find that and send that to you because he's a very careful scholar, and I was surprised. It was the first I had seen of it. I felt really remiss for not seeing that before, but apparently it may have just come to light because the rest of us would have noticed it. I think, having I went through his collected speeches and it wasn't in there. But on Gandhi quotations, I'd love to see them. I just finished a project an article. It took me a few years actually on Gandhi and Nehru and Golwalkar's world state advocacy, very different ones. And then I brought Ambedkar in there as well as giving us a model of global integration. He didn't advocate a world government, but Gandhi I've seen as far back as 1924. But if you've got if you've got a list of quotations, I'd love to see those because the more I can learn about that.
Yes, Lynn.
Well, if you're going to have a world government, the question is, whose world government is it going to be? Because it's looking like Israel, along with the US, are so hegemonic that that's going to be the world government. And if that's going to be the world government, I'd rather not stay on this planet. I'd rather jump off with Elon Musk and try another one.
Hmm. I'm not sure he's the companion I'd choose, but no, I hear you. It's a dark time, isn't it? It's 1933 all over again, only somehow it's the United States that is backsliding into something very dark and very scary indeed. So it's happening so fast. I don't have much more to say about it than everybody else does, except to be very alarmed and to hope that effective means of resistance are going to be found. I do feel like I shouldn't be in Australia at this time myself.
Why do you say that, Australia?
There's only so much you can do from here. I should be in the streets with the No Kings marchers,
Oh,
showing that. But yeah, but I wonder if I were to do that sort of thing working at a state university. I used to work at Arizona State University before I moved to Britain. I just wonder if I would be permitted to do that sort of thing these days.
Yeah, that's why I always think it's important not to really talk about world government, but democratic world federation. Always
good point, David.
Always throw the word democratic in there because when Lynn talks about whose world government, it's not a matter of who would control the world. That's exactly the opposite of a democratic world federation. In light of that, what about your next book project, Professor Cabrera? Will it be on the idea of democratic world federation? And the problem there, of course, is who gets the votes? How do you set up a world parliament to enact laws, and how are they enforced?
Yeah, that's a tough one because obviously the powerful states insist on maintaining their power. And I'll be honest with you, I haven't worked out what I consider to be a workable solution to that yet. And this goes all the way back to the critics of world government, as far back as and there's a racial overtone to this, I would say. So if you look at Hans Morgenthau, the realist political analyst, realist international relations scholar, wrote the textbook that taught millions of students for 40, 50 years, Politics Among Nations. And he's got a chapter in there on the world state from his first version of the book in 1948. And in there, he indicates, global democracy is a non-starter because, basically the white races are not going to consent to be ruled by the dark races, and the dark races will not consent to be dominated by the white races. So he splits the world into white and non-white. and says, so it's a non-starter. And I was surprised and dismayed to find so many serious commentators of that period, the 1940s, actually make some version of that claim. And then you'll see it again in Joseph Nye. He's, was one of the most prominent international relations scholars, was critiquing the idea of global democracy in the early 2000s and was not talking about race, but he was saying, Europeans and Americans won't consent to being governed by, however many billion Indians and Chinese. And it's the same sort of thing. And I think if you think about it in terms of powerful states, what will the powerful states demand for themselves? What kind of veto point will they demand for themselves, and how do you overcome that? We haven't figured it out yet. Arguably that's what's hobbling the United Nations still, the Security Council vetoes, and arguably that's what hobbled the League of Nations, not only the US not being part of it, but the powerful states being so powerful within it. I mean, every state had a veto back then, but the powerful states were able to exercise their influence even more. So I don't have a good answer for that one. But I am looking at Getting to World Government. That's the name of the book. So Getting to World Government, the Practical Politics of Global Integration. And what I've been doing is going around to some of the leading regional organizations and then also the UN to talk to people about the challenges they face, the things they're trying to do. So, the African Union has got incredibly ambitious goals on paper for a fully binding legislature. They've got a free movement protocol that's about halfway to ratification. I don't know if it will actually get there. And they've got a lot of other ambitious things. The European Union is an amazing laboratory of what might be possible in regional governance. And then you've got things like Mercosur in Latin America, which has free movement. You've got ASEAN, which has a lot of ambitions, but is a bit hobbled, I would say. And then you've got the UN, which is hobbled more every day by its most powerful member. So I'm looking at how much world government we have right now. We've got a lot of the architecture on paper. We've got the model on paper. I think if the UN were more democratic, then possibly we could call it something like a world government, because it's certainly asked to do all the things that a world government would do. If you look at what all the agencies are asked to do, the Security Council is expected to stop wars. If it could actually fulfill the things that it's asked to do on paper, it would look like a world government. Now, I think it's a very long-term prospect, and I honestly don't know what to do at this point about that veto problem and about the problem of very powerful non-democratic states, such as China, Russia, possibly the United States pretty soon.
Yeah, let me just add that I think a good answer has been provided by Joseph Schwartzberg's idea of weighted voting at the UN, which would get rid of the veto in the Security Council, along with creating world laws in the General Assembly. And Luis, I sent you my summary of Joseph's book. I think you might find that helpful. Okay.
Well, let me ask you though, real question. So what would you say to somebody in India or somewhere who says, no, it's one person, one vote. We know what democracy looks like, and that's not it. So that's what I came across his proposal some time ago, and I've just wondered and worried about that ever since. What would your response be?
Well, Schwartzberg's formula is based on population, membership in the UN, and he said for a time being, also factored in would be contributions to the UN system, thinking that richer nations would not go for a kind of system only based on population. But then over the years, he said you can change the equation by maybe giving a different a factor to population other than the way you would start with. In other words, you can change the formula. So that would be the way Schwartzberg would address it. In other words,
Yeah.
right now it'd be population plus membership plus contribution divided by 3. And he'd say, later you could do 2 times population plus membership plus contribution divided by 3. Give more weight to the population leg of the equation.
I still have my worries about path dependencies because we've never been able to get rid of even weaken the Security Council veto, even though so many good proposals have been made for that. And I worry that it would be the same thing. The rich, powerful states would never give up their privileges, their greater influence. So I
Well,
just
look at
yeah.
the proposal he has for having the Security Council based on regional areas, and how regions then would have a seat at the Security Council, and no one of them would have a veto.
Hmm.
Okay.
It's a great idea. Getting there is the devil's in the details, right? Yeah.
Of course, that's why we don't have it now. Joseph?
Well, going back to something you were saying, Louis, Professor Dudney at Johns Hopkins has said plainly that the United States is now acting like a world government. This use of the B-2 bomber against Iran is just typical. We just do it, and everybody accepts it as a kind of enforcement action by the reigning central power in the world. I've got to reread Dudney's last book. I myself have become extremely pessimistic. I think what's going to happen is that the United States effectively will make a bid for world empire, and we will compel other countries to obey and probably use military force to compel them. This will be nothing more than a great power domination of the world. But historically, that's the pattern. What happened in the American Revolution when the 13 states got together and voluntarily formed a union is very unusual. I'm very deeply troubled by that, but it seems to be true.
One of the things I'm struck by, I share your worries. One of the things I'm struck by when I'm reading a lot of the 1940s treatises is how they just thought the US would be an unproblematic model for the world, a United States for the world. So many of them just presumed that the US system had proved that it could withstand the vicissitudes of politics and challenges to democracy, and so it had stood the test of time and come out of it okay, and so it should be just applied to the world. And I think Trump's gift is that he's disabused us of that notion. We do not think that anymore.
And Lynn?
Well, it's something of a paradox, isn't it? That the way that things set up, lesser powered bodies have to come together to overpower the other bodies, when real egalitarianism is not that kind of a model. And these days I feel more like joining with Russia, and backing up Russia and China against my own country because I don't see any fairness going on with regards to Russia's supposed domination when they were, reduced from the USSR, and then NATO promises were made that were not kept. And this quest for smaller countries to have to compromise their principles and their ideals for more powerful ones that really are not as ethical. The whole thing is pretty unethical. The whole idea,
So
the setup. and the veto situation
Hmm.
is not just to start with, paradoxically and ironically.
I'm not sure if this speaks directly to your current concern, but one of the things I've been struck by is come across this sort of small vein of literature in the 80s, led by Henry Usborne, who was this longtime MP in the UK, who came out in favor of world government in the 1940s and was helping lead some of the movements. But by the 80s, he was talking about a world government that began with the middle powers. So the middle powers put it together, countries like Britain, and they lead the way to world government. So the idea being that the U.S. and USSR were just locked in this sterile struggle, nothing good could get done. So he wanted to see the middle powers join together and integrate and try to lead us to world government, which I thought was pretty interesting. I'm not sure you'd get very far in a world dominated by superpowers, but it was interesting.
Okay, because of I just there I just
It seems that his video is freezing.
Mm.
The middle countries seem like a good ideal, but unfortunately an ideal.
Mhm. Yeah, we're in a dark period right now, so it's actually hard to think about you know
And if you
sweeping
want to
global
think what you
reform.
also brought up, is it Louis or Louis?
Luis, actually.
Luis. Oh, both together. Luis. Um, is that there needs that there's not much time. You brought this issue of time up, that it takes longer, but I don't know that we have that much longer at the rate that we're going.
Hmm.
Something really needs to be done radical. I mean, all I do is I walk behind the Run for Our Lives people every Sunday, with my Palestinian flag and my Palestinian t-shirt, my keffiyeh, and just like for a presence, and I'm Jewish. And these Zionists, are like, a lot of them are very mean to me, but some of them are reasonably nice. And now we've got this city council person that's running. We have one city council person that is pro-Palestinian, but all the rest are probably extreme Zionists, basically, or they don't know really the situation. They just don't know, don't understand. And now there's a new one running, and a new pro-Palestinian one running. And for the first time in a year, every week I do this, every Sunday. And the first time in a year, I've been joined by 3 or 4 other people that joined me. That was like, what? Amazing. And on June 1st, we had a fire attack by a, an anti-Zionist, not anti-Semitic, um, Egyptian guy that, was quiet-natured, had never hurt anybody, probably saw me sitting there while they were gathering. We walk up the mall, the pedestrian mall, go to the courthouse, and they gather in front of the courthouse, and I stay away from them there, about 15 feet away. Just as I walk behind them, I don't join in with them. Luckily, I wasn't with them, or I would have been part of the fire too. And he probably saw me with my Palestinian regalia, and he had 18 Molotov cocktails. He only
Hmm.
deployed 2 of them after he had used up this sprayer that was adapted from a weed sprayer that he adapted to fuel and a spray of fire into the crowd of about 14, 15 people. And I say, why didn't he deploy the other 16 Molotovs? He'd never hurt anyone. And it shocked him. It blew back on him, actually. He threw off his shirt. He was intending to die too. But the shock of the pain and seeing the pain of the people, and he'd never hurt anyone, and then seeing me is probably why he didn't deploy the other 16 Molotov cocktails. It was a striking moment. This is a town of 107,000 people.
So this was in Boulder?
Yes.
Wow. Yeah, I remember seeing something that on the news. Yeah. Yeah, well, certainly the Palestinian, the human rights issues, I think, have motivated an awful lot of people now to demand that the humanitarian aid be allowed through. I mean, there's a big protest in my city, or a big rally, I guess you'd call it, in my
Where are
city
you
today.
at?
I'm in Brisbane, Australia. So, and there've been, all over the world, we're seeing these kind of things where people are supporting the UN calls and other people's calls to let the humanitarian aid in. So I think,
Well, it was
I think,
very interesting. I went to a film this week, um, sponsored by the JCC, about some people riding, a group of people riding bikes, regarding the Holocaust from Auschwitz to Krakow. And in this film, they depicted a number of different genocidal situations, not just the Holocaust. And then at the very end of the film, they showed an image of Gaza completely destroyed on one side of the image, on the other side, the Holocaust. And that made the film for me. And then I figured out, geez, this film was made before October 7th. And then the film director and his wife said that they added that piece 2 days ago. That image of Gaza and then the Holocaust right next to each other towards the end of the film. So thought is discerning, and people are rethinking which side of history they want to be on. And I hate for these crazed Zionists to be on the wrong side and to remain pissed off. I'd rather that they just kind of got transformed. I think that's a much better way to kind of run the world than have people more and more and more and more polarized with each other. Because you know where that ends up.
yeah. I think Evans had a question for a while. Just the last thing I'd say is my hope would be that both the people in Hamas who perpetrated October 7th and the members of the Netanyahu government who are perpetrating the current, sort of contributing to the famine would be held to account ultimately. So,
Yeah.
in the right
What
ways.
I'm left with the impression that the intellectual resources of mankind, East and West, are very weak to establish the community that we desperately need nowadays. The thing, of course, that is propelling the urgency is that first of all, the means of destruction of both weapons and climate are so immense that it does threaten everyone, not everyone. And I don't think that the intellectual elites, whether in India or here, have understood the level of threat that we're faced with. And it's, to make up for centuries of absence of moral thought and ideology as well is just an overwhelming task. So I don't know if I don't get the sense that Ambedkar's uh, approach would have the universal appeal that's needed.
Um, I think we've got his approach is human rights, and not everyone is going to affirm human rights or accept human rights, which was sort of the point in going with Ambedkar because he was operating in a context where human rights were rejected. His successors in the national campaign on Dalit human rights specifically chose the idea of human rights because to them that's what it was about. It was discrimination based on national local mores, but for them it was about citing the universal equality of human beings and being able to promote that within India. And I think human rights are the struggle, they are the salvation, if there is any, and they're the ball we have to keep our eyes on. That's the prize. And as Dag Hammarskjöld said, it's not utopia. Human rights don't get humans to heaven; they save us from hell. And so we're aiming for that basic minimum. It's a dark time right now, I agree. But and we never thought, those of us who grew up in the United States never thought we'd be here. But here we are, and pendulums swing and resistance happens. So my hope is that we continue to find our feet and push back and get past this. I mean, India's in a bad way too. Trump's taken some of his notes from India, Russia, elsewhere. Modi has taken India's democracy and turned it into that Hindu nationalist utopia that Golwalkar and some others dreamed of, and that Ambedkar and others fought against. So it is a dark time, I agree, but I don't think we should just despair. I think we have the architecture, we have the model, and we just need to keep the faith and keep pushing.
First, I'd like to apologize. My Zoom went out for 5 minutes.
So you didn't hear my sermon.
No. So I'm glad I was able to get back and finish everything up. So thank you, Professor Cabrera, for these last 3 sessions on your most recent book, and look forward to future contacts. I'd like to announce now the next book that the CGS Book Club will deal with. It's titled The Future in the Past, Reconstructing Article 109, Section 3 of the UN Charter towards the San Francisco Promise to constitutionalize the United Nations and international law. That's the whole title. And it is written by Dr. Sharyar Shari. And our first session then with Dr. Shari's book will be just 2 weeks from now, September the 6th. And it'll be during the regular daytime. It won't be an evening session like we've had these last 3 times with Dr. Cabrera. But James May will send out announcements for our next book and the times and the details about that book by Dr. Shari. So thank you all for joining tonight, and have a good evening.